Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 46th episode of the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, a podcast all about the subject of antinatalism created by antinatalists. My name is Amanda Oldphan Sukenick, formerly known as Forever Wolf Films on YouTube.
And I'm Mark J. Maharaj, also known as Question Mark on YouTube.
And today, we're speaking with PhD candidate in space science at the University of New South Wales, pivotal participant in the Animal Justice Party, YouTuber and host of the Morality is Hard podcast and blog, Michael Dello-Iacovo, also known as Vegan Space Scientist. Michael, welcome to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast. How are you today?
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm doing pretty good today, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, it was a pleasure to have you. So let's just start out with the most basic question. Who is Vegan Space Scientist?
So, the YouTube channel, it's sort of morphed from a couple of different things over time. It started off really without any direction at all, and it was just under my name. And then I changed the name when I tried to get a little bit more strategic about what I was posting about. So a few years ago, I started posting. I wanted to post about some animal rights things, but also space science, which I was doing my research on. So came up with Vegan Space Scientist, and yeah, so I've been pretty lax on the YouTube channel the later half of this year because I've been mostly trying to focus on finishing my PhD. I should be hopefully resubmitting my thesis soon. Fingers crossed, so that's what the channel is. And for me myself, I do a couple of things at the moment. So one is my PhD in space science. I started doing that because, or just to back up, my research is about looking at how we can map the interior of other planetary bodies using geophysics. So particularly interested in asteroids because of the relevance for asteroid deflection, for space mining, and things like that. But also for I wanted to try and do something that utilized my background, which is earth science and geology, but think about some big picture future kind of questions like the ethics of terraforming other planets. Should we do it? What are the pros and cons? Mining other planets and all of that stuff. So most of my research is on the technical side, but I also try and comment on the ethics of all that as much as I can. I guess my background is so I had a big change in my life about, it was about 8 years ago now, maybe actually 9 years, I think. I wasn't really doing much with my life and I was kind of failing my undergrad, and it took like a pretty big depressive episode for me to kind of change my life and decide that I want to try and do something with my life. And I decided I wanted to help others and reduce suffering. So that led me to ultimately become vegan and become involved in the Animal Justice Party to fight for legal change for non-human animals. It led me to become involved in the effective altruism movement, which is about how do we use our resources, limited time and resources, as effectively as possible to have as much of a positive impact. And that led me to my PhD topic as well. So I think that brings us to today. So I'm doing my PhD, I'm working with the Animal Justice Party, and also running for council for election later this year.
Excellent. Thank you. You spoke a little bit about this already, but of course, you're working towards this PhD in planetary science. May I ask how close you are to your graduation? And can you talk a little bit more too about your educational history and how you specifically came to pursue planetary science as your PhD degree?
Sure. So I'm in terms of how close I'm to finishing, I submitted my thesis last year, and the review committee came back with some recommended changes. So I've been doing that this year. They wanted an extra chapter and some other stuff. So I should be on track for resubmitting in a couple of weeks. I'd got another draft of feedback from my supervisors, hopefully in a few weeks. And then, ideally, if the committee accepts it, it should be finished in a few months. But if not, we'll see. But hopefully not too far away. So my background, I did my undergraduate in geology and geophysics. as a Bachelor of Science. So that way was mostly focused on, there wasn't really much planetary science, space science in there. That was mostly on, I guess, understanding the history of the Earth and also the applications for resources industry and energy industry. So I worked for 18 months in an energy company in South Australia. It was an oil and gas company, and the reason I chose to work there is because I had this idea that I wanted to try and create some change from the inside of the company. I had, I'd done work experience there, and I felt like there was an angle for me to maybe come in and have some positive impact. Ultimately, I feel like I didn't have as much of a positive impact as I expected and hoped. So then I ended up starting my PhD and moving to Sydney to do that full time.
Best of luck. I hope you get some positive news soon about your next review, and that's great.
Thanks.
Yeah, Michael, why are you or are you not an anti-natalist?
I am an anti-natalist, or I'd describe myself as that. I think though, I'll say this for the sake of the listeners because I'm sure you are both aware, but there's this distinction between, I guess, soft and hard anti-natalist. So a hard anti-natalist, I think, is kind of maybe the general definition that people think of when they think of anti-natalist. It's that you think a life is never, how do I explain? It's the idea that it's never worth bringing a life into existence for that life's own sake. So their existence can never be justified. Bring them into existence can never be justified for their own sake. And then soft antinatalism, I think, is I think gosh, I've forgotten the name of the person who I think coined that, so apologies to them. But that's the idea that it's procreating and bringing a life into existence is not worth it now. It may not be worth it in the practical near-term future, but it's not on principle always bad to bring a life into existence. So there could be some time in the future where you think that it would be worth bringing a human life into existence. I think I find myself in the middle a little bit, but I lean towards the soft antinatalism, I think. So I do think that it's unethical to procreate, and I have no plans of doing that myself. And I think that's almost certainly going to be the case for the very long-term future. But I do think there are some scenarios where it could be worth bringing a life into existence. I think the key difference that I find often arises between people and those two different camps is whether you think that a life of no suffering is, I guess, positive or neutral, so to speak. So, I mean, I guess maybe to put it in a different way that's maybe a bit simpler, I describe myself as a total utilitarian. So I think that suffering is a net bad, ethically speaking, and pleasure is a net good. Whereas I think I think that to find yourself in the hard antinatalism camp, you'd have to think that suffering is net bad, but also that pleasure is I guess, neutral or not actually good.
I mean, I just want to say, I mean, I do ask about this a little bit later as well, but the terms hard and soft antinatalism are so very fascinating to me because so few people, I think, use them. I mean, from what I understand, they were terms that were coined by David Pierce.
That's it.
And I didn't even know until earlier today. Mark knows the origin of them a little bit better than I do, but yeah, there's intricacies and how they're separated that are pretty new to me. I have to be honest, just because I don't hear that many people use them.
Can I get a clarification on your total hedonic utilitarianism? Because like any utilitarian would say that pleasure is you're going to maximize that, but you are total, like you're going to take the average from a population size to determine whether or not something's good or bad, correct?
Yes, yeah, I believe so. I mean, there is negative utilitarian, which I mean, that's I would think that a negative utilitarian would say that pleasure is neutral. So, like, for example, someone living a life with no suffering and maximal bliss is just as good as someone not existing. Yeah. So I did too. So yeah, I think that suffering is bad, pleasure is good, and there is some amount of one that will always be able to outweigh some amount of the other.
But why total? Why total utilitarian?
Do you mean why?
Well, why pick that one? Because like there's
yeah,
exactly. Why take the average and why take an impersonal view of what is good away from the individual agent?
So I mean, I think that what is good is the experience of is the positive or negative experience, and that it is a
the sum.
Sorry,
the sum,
right?
So why so why value the sum? Let me put it that way.
What I think is fundamentally valuable. I guess the only things that I think could be fundamentally valuable are the felt experience of an individual, and then it's either positive, which I think is a good outcome, or negative suffering, which is a bad outcome.
So would you reject preferences?
Like
preference utilitarianism?
To an extent, yes. So I mean, I think that people often, or any life, just because they express a preference of something doesn't mean it's actually better for them, I guess.
So you've rejected negative utilitarianism and you've rejected preference utilitarianism, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So what I'm trying to get at is, what was your process, or what was your what were the steps to get you to your normative theory right now?
A sentient mind has things that it's sort of, I guess it's like a bit like a carrot and a stick, where there's things that they want is not quite the right word, because that's preference. So it's not, I'm trying to think of another word that I want to use, but it's there's two types of experiences, I think. Ones that have a positive, positive and negative, and I think that those are the only two things that a sentient mind can value, and everything else I think is just kind of a proxy for getting to one of those two things. And then if those are the only two things that can be valued, then I just then apply that to all life and think that if anything can be considered ethically good, then it's surely the one thing that all sentient minds are trying to get. And if anything can be considered bad, it's the one thing that they're all trying to get away from.
When you went through this process of, well, you said depression, but it's kind of like an existential crisis, so to speak, right? Because you were contemplating, I'm assuming, what is the good, right? And what is the right thing to do? Was your introduction to ethics and morality through people like Peter Singer and Bostrom and the effect of altruism talking heads, I guess you would call them?
No, so I think I came to it fairly independently. It was around the age of when I was about 17 or 18, and I heard those terms, utilitarianism, deontology, etc., for the first time. I watched online a first year ethics lecture or something, and I just thought that the utilitarian side made sense. And I only really discovered Peter Singer and effective altruism and all that quite a bit later, when I think I'd already come to my own conclusions about ethics.
And what do you think about, because there tends to be a split, right, between deontology and utilitarianism. Obviously there's more, but I'm just curious about what you do think about deontology.
Yeah, I see deontology as there's two sources for it. One is sort of a religious or supernatural source, where this thing is always right or always wrong because some greater power says that. Or the other way people can get to it is it's not something they necessarily think about or realize, but I think they're using it as a proxy for utilitarianism, basically, where they're saying, I guess it's not a conscious thought process, but it's, why people have this view that it's always wrong to lie or always wrong to kill. But I guess if you think deeper about why do we think those things are always wrong, it's because they're proxies for avoiding suffering and achieving well-being, where it feels wrong to be lied to, or you think that that leads to more negative outcomes, or it feels wrong to harm someone or to steal from them. Like it feels bad. It's a felt experience. And so, yeah, I think that if you're not getting to it from the religious side, I think you're getting to deontology through these sort of like social norms that we've built, because they tend to lead to better outcomes when you follow those rules.
Yeah. And when you said why you're not a hard anti-natalist, it was because you could see some situations where it would be okay to procreate. Could you name some of them?
Sure. Well, so it would have to be something like if there was a time when I thought that the net impact of an average life being brought into existence was net positive when carried out the long-term impacts of that over the future. Does that make sense?
Yep.
It's very broad, because I wouldn't want to name like any specific scenarios, but I mean, one example might be if I was very confident that the total impact of the future was, if life survives on Earth, the total value of the future was very net positive, that there was going to be very little suffering and a lot of well-being if we spread and colonize other planets. If that were the case, and then if it were the case that also, I guess it would have to be that the marginal impact of bringing a life into existence would be, it would also then be reducing the risk of human extinction, and also it's not going to, another consideration would be how much is it going to impact the lives of people alive today, and how much is it going to impact that, I mean, what's that individual's quality of life going to be as well. So it's all of that kind of added up together into the question of, does that bring about total net positive outcome?
Quite a difficult calculation to make.
Of course, yeah.
You mentioned if it had, I forgot the term you used, like more positive, or what if it was just a life barely worth living? So if I was to appeal to the repugnant conclusion, how would you feel to that? How would you feel about that?
Yeah, I tend to just bite. I guess I'd bite the bullet for the repugnant conclusion. I don't see it as repugnant.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's of course with the caveat of we have to. It requires you to be sure about or at least confident about the outcome.
You are, of course, also very concerned with the suffering of animals, both farmed and wild. To what extent do the lives of animals influence your antinatalism?
Yeah, I don't think it influences it, but I guess it's relevant because, well, for farmed animals, their lives are very clearly not worth living. But then also for wild animals, I think it's quite plausible that most wild animals do not have lives worth living either, which, I guess when people think of wild animals, they think of things like giraffes living what looks like a pretty good life. But when you really think about it, even giraffes have to battle with predators and starvation and cold and all that. And then also the average life is probably, well, the average sentient mind on Earth is probably mostly insects, I think. And insects, it's reasonable to believe, I think, that they are sentient to some degree, and their life just seems absolutely horrific. I mean, they give birth to thousands of young. Most of them die very quickly, very young, and then the ones that do survive have to deal with all the other stuff that I mentioned. So yeah, I guess I think about wild animals through the antinatalist lens as well, I guess, in that I don't think that the average wild animal has a life worth living.
How does your consideration of insects impact your daily life, or does it?
It does, yeah, a little bit. So I try very hard to not kill insects. I look where I'm walking. If there's an insect in my house, I'll try and take it outside without harming them. So I mean, that's probably the extent of it, just in terms of my day-to-day life. I won't use like insecticide when Like I won't use any kind of traps or anything that would harm or kill an insect.
Can I pose a counter argument to antinatalism to figure out how you would process this? You're concerned about wild animal suffering, as am I. If more humans were on Earth, do we not shift the amount of animals that are being in the wild, where that population goes down? Would that not be a good thing?
So just to summarize the argument, it's that if there are more humans, there's more land being taken up, I guess, maybe for like living space, and then there's less biomass of insects. Yeah. I think I've heard that before, but I have to think a little bit about what I think about that argument. So I guess I find that plausible that could be the case. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little bit more.
Hopefully I didn't have like an effect of like turning your mind on this one.
No, I'm not sure. I mean, I think I've vaguely heard that argument before, but never really thought too hard about it. So okay. Yeah, I mean, I've heard. I think the other one I've heard a little bit more is sometimes I've heard there's an argument for not being vegan if you're concerned about animals, because if you eat animal products and there's more land being used up for growing animal feed.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that one as well.
Yeah, so for that one, I think it's a little bit clearer that promoting eating animals as a social norm to try and protect animals seems like not the best way to go about it in the long run, because if you instead promote just concern for non-human minds, which I see vegan as being like not quite the same thing, but that's a good way to do it, to encourage people to be vegan or to be concerned about animal rights. I would hope that you are getting closer to a society where people are more concerned about non-human minds in general, and then that scenario where people maybe start to think about like, oh, okay, well, how can we, what can we do to, I think that non-humans have moral worth. So, that then I think wild animal non-humans have moral worth. And so what can we do to improve their lives? And so I think that while it might be the case that in the short run, maybe you get less wild animal suffering by eating animal products instead of eating plant products, I think I think in terms of like spreading like good, what I'd see as like good norms, I don't think that's ideal in the long run. But it is a tricky one. I don't think it's like an immediately obvious answer.
Right. Thanks.
In addition to being a philosophical position, anti-natalism over the last 10 years or so has also become a social movement as well. What is your general exposure to and opinion of this side of anti-natalism?
I think my only exposure, apart from online, would be, I think, the vegans and animal rights activists who I, in my social network in Sydney, there seems to be a pretty big overlap between vegans and antinatalists here. So
interesting.
Yeah, is that I guess because it's my only experience really. So I sort of thought, well, I guess that makes sense, and I guess then I just sort of assumed that was a general overlap.
Well, no, it definitely makes sense. I think it still feels kind of new to me to hear people saying that they're meeting people in real life identifying as anti-natalist, and okay. And of course I think logically that's happening within a lot of vegan circles. I mean, that's kind of where you'd go to find it, I think, but I didn't know that was happening as much as you seem to be saying that it is in Sydney. So that's very interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go to say some event with fellow vegans in Sydney, and they'll just be casually discussing sometimes like why it's wrong to procreate, for example. Like it's very accepted, and I'd say most people would consider themselves at least child-free out of people in my vegan network.
How do you feel anti-natalism intersects with other social and ethical issues such as atheism, veganism, the right to die, and effective altruism?
Just as an observation, I have noticed that almost all anti-natalists I know are atheist, or at least don't subscribe to an organized religion, or at least that I'm aware of. And in fact, I can't think of an example of an anti-natalist who is not atheist, or at least agnostic to some degree. So I don't quite know how to take that. Maybe it's just that if you think there's an afterlife, that kind of changes your perception of the ethicalness of procreating. I think that for you, that would, for the other individual, that would change the whole scenario quite a lot. And then for effective altruism, I think so that effective altruism being like a frame of how you think about ethical questions and how you think about what you ought to do or what you can do with your life to reduce suffering or to do good or whatever. I mean, that kind of view, frame of thinking led me to antinatalism. So I think, that's a big overlap. And then, sorry, you mentioned a few others, I think.
Veganism and the right to die.
Yeah, right to die. I haven't really thought about that before in terms of antinatalism. Just off the top of my head, I guess. I don't really know. I haven't thought about that before. Veganism, I think I've mentioned a little bit about why I think that's similar, where you're talking about bringing lives into existence that are quite clearly not worth living, and how that can't be justified. Yeah. I think I wanted to mention this a little bit earlier. I think it's a little bit relevant to here, but so in terms of how effective altruism interacts with antinatalism, so there's sort of a different way that I think you can get to antinatalism as well. I think before I really even knew what the word antinatalism meant, or before I'd heard that word, I intended to not have children. And at the time it was primarily my main reason was the opportunity cost. So it was more just that I know how much time and money it takes to raise a child on average. And so I felt like I couldn't justify it on those terms when I could be spending that time and money donating to an effective charity or something, or the other things I could be doing with that time and money. And then the other sort of arguments relating to antinatalism informed me later on. So I think in terms of how people can get to antinatalism from effective altruism, or at least some kind of soft antinatalism, I think you can get there through like the opportunity cost argument.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. As you may know, antinatalism is sometimes split into 4 generalized categories. Anti-natalism, which is both its own category as well as an umbrella term. Then there's ethicism. Then there's Vehement, which is the voluntary human extinction movement. And then finally, there's child-free. Do you have any thoughts on any or each of these by chance?
So yeah, child-free, I think, I guess like child-free is like maybe a broader category that antinatalism would be a part of, because if you're an antinatalist, you're probably child-free. My experience with child-free in general is mostly I'm subscribed to the child-free Reddit page, and it's just interesting. Okay, yeah. I find it interesting to read their stories on there. It's interesting. I mean, I suppose not all of them would be anti-natalist, but there are some things in there that feel very relevant to me, like how other people see you as not someone who's not doesn't want to have a child. Then ethicism, just to check, that's the idea that ending all life would be good, or is that?
Yeah, that all sentient life is essentially the biggest problem in the universe, and
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. And I mean, if I was a hard anti-natalist, I think I would also be an ethicist.
Okay.
Yeah, but because I'm not, I'm sympathetic to it because because I think that it's probably more likely that the future, if their life survives, would be full of more suffering than full of like net well-being.
Yeah.
So I'm open to it, I guess, for maybe a slightly different reason.
Yeah.
And then the voluntary human extinction movement, I haven't really interacted with that movement really at all. So all my encounters of it are very secondhand. But I guess it's the same with ethicism, where if I was a hard anti-natalist, I'd probably see it a little bit differently, but sympathetic to it because of the reasons I mentioned before.
Yeah, the biggest difference between like Vehement and ethicism is that, Vehement wants humans to go extinct, but they want the animals
I see. Okay.
go on forever, which is pretty much exactly the opposite of, well, not the opposite of ethicism, but ethicism doesn't want anything to remain. So that's basically the biggest difference between, or that's essentially what Vehement is. Yeah,
I see. I find it interesting to think about the difference between all life going extinct on Earth and humans going extinct on Earth.
Yeah,
because I think those would lead to very different outcomes. Like, I think in that case I'd be less sympathetic to voluntary human extinction, because then that would leave the problem of wild animal suffering for maybe a very, very long time, billions of years.
Right. Exactly.
Without any humans here to address that problem, which I guess that maybe that's a little bit narcissistic, but I think that's a possible good that humans could be involved in, is tackling wild animal suffering.
Absolutely. That's very much my opinion as well. Yeah.
Can I just the thing that you said about your if you were to predict like there'd be more suffering in the long-term future, I wanted to ask what your opinion is on long-termism.
Well, I think long-termism is my interpretation of that is just that it's thinking about the very long-term effects of actions and making sure that that comes into your ethical calculus, rather than just being very short-term focused, or rather than just thinking about lives that are in existence today. You're also thinking about the impact of things on lives that don't yet exist. Then with long-termism, I guess you could end up on either side of the argument, in that you think, for the idea of existential risk, you're applying long-termism thinking to that. You could end up on thinking that life on Earth going extinct is good, or you could come out thinking that's bad. So I see long-termism as just like a tool for thinking about, or a way of thinking about those kind of problems.
What side do you take?
Well, I lean to thinking that the expected value of the future if life continues to exist is negative. Weakly leaning, I would say, but leaning to that side.
So charities that are working towards existential risk, what would you think about that?
Yeah, so I've changed my mind on that. Basically, I think that it's too uncertain for me to justify supporting those in terms of like what is the impact of that. But I wouldn't also actively, what's the opposite of support, like fight against those kind of organizations, because I think just from a practical perspective, it's so well ingrained in most people's minds that stopping extinction of humans or of life is good, that I choose to focusing on if there is a future for life, making sure that it's good, or making sure there's as little suffering as possible, which is, I guess, why I focus more on animal rights advocacy now, because I think that has positive effects into the future of spreading the ideas that non-humans are worthy of moral consideration. I hope that spreading that idea into the future will make the future less bad, if there is a future for life.
Are you engaged socially with the effective altruism movement? Because I'm curious what their reaction has been to your views.
So I am. I'm engaged with the effective altruism movement, and I mean, there are some people in the movement who share my view to a whole kind of like spectrum from people who, yeah, I guess it would go the whole way from people who are negative utilitarian to just skeptical that the future is net positive. And then I guess in between that is, leaning to thinking it's not positive and skeptical about it, and then leaning to think it's positive, and then thinking that, we have to make sure we kind of I guess what I'd see as like the Nick Bostrom view, which is we have to make sure that nothing else is more important than making sure there is a future for human life because of all the value of human life in the future.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think probably most people in effective housing movement would lean towards that Nick Bostrom side to some degree. But I think that my impression has been that people in the movement are open enough to other views that they will kind of hear me out and think, if the future was net negative, then they can understand my view or something like that.
Thank you. I'm glad that that's been your experience.
I'd love to spend some time talking to you about your YouTube channel and just a couple of questions about some specific videos. So
Sure.
Wanted to say real quick, I didn't write any questions exactly about this, but Mark and I were remarking before we started recording that, we love that you make videos about atheism. And it's just kind of rare to see now people making content about that subject on YouTube. That used to be such an enormous part of what YouTube philosophy discussion was about. And so just love that part of your channel, even though it's not, quite the subject of today's topic. But in your video, Why I Will Never Have a Child, Anti-Natalism and Ethics, you describe your main reason for not wanting to have a child is money and time, as you talked a little bit about earlier, which, let me just say for the record, is a fantastic reason to not want to have a kid. You also expressed that you feel that reason isn't very highly valued by a lot of anti-natalists. These reasons are, however, very highly valued by the child-free community. So I'm just curious if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you feel to be the differences between the anti-natalist and child-free worlds in this regard at all. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I think can't remember what I said in that video, but I think at least my views might have changed a little bit on that. Just to clarify, I think now I would think that probably that is, if you put that argument to an anti-natalist, they'd probably agree with it. But I guess I wouldn't see that as being like the main argument or the main way that they came to anti-natalism. Sure. Yeah. So I think child-free is interesting. You could, like I see anti-natalism as being like I said, sort of a subset of child-free to an extent, or you have to probably be child-free to be an anti-natalist, but there's a lot of other ways to get to child-free that don't involve anti-natalism at all. It could, I guess, to be child-free, there could be selfish reasons and selfless reasons to get there. And I think the selfish reasons are perfectly fine as well. Just to give an example, if you think that you would really not enjoy being a parent, which might lead you to be child-free, I think that's a perfectly valid reason. I think actually, absolutely, I would commend that. I would commend that, and I don't see that being selfish as being a bad thing. No. So yeah, and then other ways you can get there without being anti-natalist, I suppose, is I think the opportunity cost. You could get there without seeing yourself as an anti-natalist as well, if you want to do some good and you think that you couldn't justify it, or you think that maybe you'd enjoy it, but you think you'd be a bad parent. So I find it interesting to think, because I think I'm sort of lucky in a sense that I think I would very much not enjoy having a child. It would be, I think, a terrible experience for me, just from my own selfish perspective. And so just for interest, there's never been a point in my life where I've even had the thought that I would one day want to have a child or might want to have a child. Ever since I even thought about it from the age of very young teenager, it's been, I don't want to have a child because it just sounds terrible. And then I guess reasons were added onto that as time went on. And then it became, well, I think I'd probably be a pretty bad parent. And then the opportunity cost and the anti-natalism stuff. Yeah, but to come back to the question, so yeah, I think there's enough overlap that I think people on both sides could potentially see each other as allies. So, and again, my experience is largely just reading stories on the child-free Reddit page and just thinking how a lot of that feels very relevant to me in terms of how when someone finds out I don't want to have a kid and they say, well, you change your mind and all that stuff. And I find the child-free subreddit a very useful resource for that.
Okay, yeah, interesting. In this video, you express being a bit concerned that, about getting negative feedback for suggesting that, other people perhaps should not have children. Did you receive any such feedback?
I was very surprised to get very little negative feedback.
Okay, good.
Which really, really surprised me. So I posted that video on Facebook, which was like a pretty nerve-wracking thing. I have a lot of people I know in real life. I wanted to do that because I wanted to, I guess, challenge myself, and I wanted to get the feedback of other people who I knew. There are a few people who gave rather negative responses. Someone who I went to school with who was very, very negative. I mean, that's kind of the standard example. They were, I guess they're quite religious and were coming at it from that angle. So that was not very pleasant. But overall, I was very surprised at how little negative feedback I got. And I got quite a bit of positive feedback of people saying, thank you for sharing this. I have similar views, or I have some of these views, and it's nice to know other people out there think about this in the same way. There was a couple of negative YouTube comments, which is not that surprising from someone anonymous. That's
par for the course.
Of course. Yeah. But I honestly, even to this point now, I'm still kind of surprised that I didn't get more negative feedback from people I know personally. It's interesting. I mean, I think my parents knew for a long time that I didn't want to have kids, and I think they just got more and more realizing of how serious I was about that. And probably that video was like the final nail in the coffin for them to think, oh, he's publishing on Facebook, he's probably that's it. But I think they'd accepted it by that point. I was very surprised that I didn't get much negative feedback. I mean, I expected to get some negative feedback from people I know who are my age or a little bit older who have had kids, which I do know some. I mean, it could just be that they didn't want to engage in, that maybe they felt negatively about it, but just didn't think it was worth to talk to me about it, I suppose. But yeah, that's overall surprising.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm very glad to hear that. I'm just a brief quote from that video. You say, as living organisms, we evolved to want to procreate. It's wired into us. My biological tendencies could kick in and cause me to change my mind at any point. Now, I'm sure you're very well aware there's a great deal of debate around this. Like, are we actually hardwired to want to procreate? Or are we simply hardwired to just want to have sex? Procreation being that unintended product, of that. Has your idea of this changed at all, or do you? I'm just curious to know your current thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't think it's changed a lot, but I hadn't quite thought about it, to be honest, in the way that you just put it, which is what are we really hardwired to do here? Like, is the procreation like a secondary thing? Because I just, my intuition is that it feels like I'd still feel like it's separate, because there's almost like two different desires that people can have, one of or the other, or at the same time. Like, I think just it's hard to think, like, you think about someone who maybe is, if let's say they're in their 30s and they feel like they really want to have a child, that seems separate to the more like short-term kind of desire of wanting to have sex. Like, it doesn't quite feel like that's the same thing to me. But that's an intuition I haven't thought about a lot. Yeah. It's just that I'd be surprised if the reason why someone is thinking that is because they want to have sex. And I guess when that is it, I don't know, this is more of a question, but is it the case that if someone's like sexual desire has been fulfilled, does their desire to have a child like lessen in the short term? But that could be interesting, but I don't know the answer to that.
I'm not 100%. I mean, I've heard arguments both ways, but I think the feeling is that, you know, sex is this deeply ingrained biological thing that we're propelled to do, whereas perhaps the pressure to, or the inclination to have children is more of a social meme of natalism that's so deeply been ingrained into us socially that it feels almost, or we interpret it as a biological part of that biological function, but is it or isn't it? It's just interesting to hear where people fall on that in that argument. You have expressed a certain distaste, and I'm not sure distaste is exactly the right word, as Mark and I were discussing earlier, with the Benatarian asymmetry. If I'm not mistaken, mostly because you do not believe that birth is always a harm. I know we talked a little bit about this earlier, but so you believe that having a child isn't always full stop bad for the child. What are some of the instances where it could be better than bad to have that child for the child?
Yeah, for the child's own sake.
Yeah.
Well, I would suggest that if that child had a very great life with relatively small amount of suffering and a lot of happiness and well-being, that would be for that child positive outcome.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think that comes back to my like total utilitarian view.
Right.
And I don't know why. Like, I really want to understand your total utilitarian view. Who's it good for?
It's good for the individual who experiences the well-being.
But the individual doesn't exist.
Yeah. So I'm glad you talked about that. Or you mentioned that. So I think that doesn't matter because it's not about, I guess, the individual. It's about the total amount of well-being or the total amount of suffering. So, and then I guess where the issue I have with the asymmetry is it's also, I guess my view would be that you can say the same thing about the suffering and that, well, who's it bad for to procreate, because there's no one that exists for it to be bad for.
Right. Yeah. So there's two parts to it. Is one, the good of the total, and good of for the individual. And the thing is, so I think I misspoke. I said you take the average, but you don't take the average as a total, right?
Yes.
There's a distinction.
Yeah.
Okay, you're right.
It's the total suffering and well-being added together.
So okay. So if you take the total, if I'm going to say, okay, I can create a being, and the being is going to have a net positive life, right? Then this is good for the total. My question is, who's the total good for? Because without them, there's no deprivation.
I can try and answer that in a roundabout way, which is to give another thought experiment, which I like. It's so I guess suppose there was suppose you could choose to either put something in place that would bring about more happiness and well-being for some children who don't exist yet. You put money into a fund that's going to give you a return in 10 years, and the child is going to be for children who are 6 years old, so they don't exist yet. I would think that putting that money into to set that in motion would still be a good thing, even though
but that's contingent on the fact that they will exist, right? Like you have a decision to whether or not they are or not going to be existent. So given the constraints of yes, they will exist. Absolutely, I care about future persons. But if I have a choice to create them or not, why should I create them?
My view would be that because I think a life existing, experiencing well-being is and a good, net good in its own sake.
For its own sake, so it's like an intrinsic good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Could you explain that a little bit more?
I'm not sure. Not easily, I think.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I guess like that's the part that I wrestle with is I totally agree with you. Like, yeah, absolutely, it would increase the good, but at the same time, I'm thinking, well, who's this? It feels like humans are, or any sentient being would be a container of these values that we value, right? And my question is, why create these containers in the first place if there is no need to create them, right? Why create need from no need? That's what I'm wrestling with. I'm totally agreeing with you that there's the good, and I want to maximize the good, but I'm maximizing the good for either beings that currently exist or that will, I know that they'll exist in the future. But if I have a decision of whether or not I can create them, I'm having a hard time saying I ought to create them because there's this net positive utility that's going to come into place from a total utilitarian point of view. Because I'm like, well, what's that? Who's that benefiting? If there is no deprivation to be had in the first place.
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer because I kind of have a sense of that in my mind, but it's really hard to find the right words to explain. But I guess, like, I'll try. I mean, when I think about like time, I think about like future points in time as being kind of just as valid points of time as like the present point in time. So I think it doesn't, I guess I'd say like, it doesn't matter that that individual doesn't exist yet, because we can choose to make them exist in the future. And I really being challenged here, which is good, to try and explain this. But I think I can come back to saying that I think it's good for its own sake for there to be more lives with net positive experiences.
Yeah. Okay.
You wrote a paper about the Benettarian asymmetry. Can you tell us a little bit about this paper that you wrote?
Sure. So I talked about a lot of things in that paper. It was for an essay prize, the Sentience Politics Essay Prize in 2016. So it really was just kind of, I was fairly new to the effective altruism movement. I'd sort of been like, I'd been hearing a lot about these ideas like terraforming and wild animal suffering and a lot of stuff like that. And I just wanted to write my thoughts about kind of all of it at once in one paper. So that's where it came about. So I talked about wild animal suffering, and then I talked about terraforming. So the idea of transforming another planet, Mars is the most common example, into having an atmosphere that can support life, either for human benefit or to, sometimes people talk about taking, say, like, I guess, wilding Mars to put non-human life on there, animal life, plant life. And in my sort of field of space science, it's very much taken as a granted that is definitely a good thing to do that, to terraform Mars and to colonize Mars. And I was talking through the lens of, well, if we're concerned about wild animal suffering and if we think wild animals have net negative lives, then it's very not clear whether that would be a good thing. It might even be a very bad thing to terraform Mars, or just terraforming in general. And then I also talked a little bit about, I guess, the asymmetry argument, because I'd recently read some of Benett's work, and I thought that felt relevant to kind of all those general topics as a package. And I guess I put forward some of my, not quite criticisms, but why I disagreed with the asymmetry argument and why I ended up on more of a total utilitarian view. And I think I invoked some of Sam Harris's work, like the sort of the best possible universe full of maximum well-being and no suffering as being a good thing, and then the worst possible universe, and talking about some of those distinctions and then why that led me to disagree with the asymmetry argument.
talking a little bit about another video that you made on your channel, would human extinction be good or bad? It's a really fascinating video. By the end of your video, you sort of reach an impasse. Spoiler alert. You sort of determine that you're not entirely sure, which is fair enough. I was wondering if you would mind breaking down your thoughts on extinction, and this can, I think the video focused on human extinction. If you'd like to also give your thoughts on sentient extinction too, that would be great, but you certainly don't have to. Why would it be good? Why would it be bad in your mind?
Yeah, sure. So, I haven't watched that video back in a while, so I'm trying to remember what I said there. But I mean, just to give my general thoughts now, maybe. So yeah, there's a I guess I see a lot of pros and cons of human extinction, to take that one first. Pros such as no more farming of non-humans. There'd be less suffering if you just take the suffering aspect of what it is to be human. We suffer, we have well-being, so there'd be less suffering. And if we think there's a possibility of spreading suffering throughout the galaxy, then human extinction would mean we can avoid that. But then the flip side of that is, if we think there's the possibility of us spreading a lot of bliss through the universe or through the galaxy, wherever, that's a downside. If we think that's the more likely outcome, that's just about likelihood, I guess, and magnitude. And then also the idea that we might be able to do something about wild animal suffering if we continue as a species. And then also the possibility of how we could influence, say, if we think there's life on other planets throughout the universe, maybe if they have kind of sentient life but not intelligent life, to the extent of colonizing other planets. There is, and this is probably one of the weakest, what I think is the weakest argument. It's just but it is a factor still. Just the possibility that we could stop the wild animal suffering on these other planets as well. I think that could be a positive as well. So there's a lot of stuff here with lots of uncertainty, and that's what makes it very hard for me to think about whether it would be a good or a bad thing.
Yeah.
But I think my main point I wanted to get out of that video is, and it was sort of directed at a little bit at the effective altruism community, was just to get people to think, maybe you have been assuming that it will be positive, but here are some reasons why it might not be positive.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I thought the video did a really good job of getting people to consider both sides of it, and it was yeah. You mentioned at one point in the video that a negative reason, I mean, if we were to go extinct, we wouldn't have the possibility of achieving something that I was not familiar with until this video, called cosmic endowment. Can you tell me a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so I think that's coined by Nick Bostrom. It's cosmic endowment is it's like the sum of the good that could be achieved in the future if we were to, say, colonize the galaxy. I see it as like a very much a best case scenario. I think probably, I mean, I would imagine Nick Bostrom would have to agree that it's like the best case scenario.
I see. Okay.
Well, I don't know their views on that, but I would assume so. But it's the idea that if you think about, so he gives the example of, like, well, let's say there's there's this many colonizable, habitable planets in the galaxy, and how it's like in the future of human life, if we colonize the galaxy, how many lives are there that would be lived? And that's kind of the potential of, like, that many lives living positive lives. So yeah, I guess the cosmic endowment is sort of it's sort of a way of thinking about what's the best case scenario for what would happen with human life if it survived and spread off from Earth, I suppose. Yeah.
I see. Okay. Do you think, or if hard antinatalism were to catch on, Do you think that that form of antinatalism, perhaps all antinatalism, would be considered an existential threat? Is this an idea that would ultimately be really upsetting to those interested in existential risk? And do you think that it would be seen as a catastrophic threat? Particularly people working towards extinction.
Yeah. So I think this is what you mean, but just to check, like existential threat is something that could cause extinction of either human life or all life.
Yeah,
and then catastrophic is more like probably won't create an extinction, but it still could be really bad. Like let's say like an asteroid impact or something that would like devastate a continent. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I'm using the same words.
Absolutely. No, you got it perfectly.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I think I already know people who see antinatalism as being a potential existential threat, and have expressed probably some concern about that, about what would happen if the ideas of antinatalism were to spread much more widely. This is an idea from actually a science fiction book, but I think it's kind of expresses the worry someone might have if they see antinatalism as an existential threat, in that as technology advances, the ability for one individual to cause damage just keeps going up, and they might get to a point somewhere in the future where someone has the technology, some average human has the technology to, I don't know, create like a black hole or something, and to kill everyone on Earth. So that, I mean, that's one like science fiction example, but there could be a lot of other examples of where more and more so individuals have the ability to threaten all human life on Earth, or a group or a nation or something like that. So if for those of that view around the value of the future being positive, I can understand why they'd see that as a threat. And I don't know what really I don't know how that's going to play out in the future as antinatalism, I assume, is going to become more and more prevalent. Will there be more and more tension between those two sides, I suppose? And I don't really know how that will play out, but I suspect there will be even more tension around that in the future. And sorry, I've forgotten, I think, the second part of that question.
And so have I, actually. I think you pretty. I think I mentioned something about catastrophic threat, but I think you basically covered it. Following from that a little bit. So this comes from a part of your video talking about the importance of shaping the future, considering the future, a certain long-termist perspective, which I do agree with in part, at least. I think it's extremely important to consider what the future of sentience will look like into the far future. I personally don't believe that there is a far future for sentience. I don't think we have billions of years to look forward to, which I've heard some people project. So I personally believe sentient extinction is the best outcome. And I think that the best we can do is a sort of like palliative care. And, we have to attempt to basically the most graceful euthanasia. What do you think about that?
So, yeah, it's something I'm certainly open to it. I guess I'd have to be very sure to advocate for that, like very, very sure, because the difference is there's a little bit of a difference between doing that and not doing that, in that with not doing that, you maintain the option of doing that in the future. But if you do the humane euthanasia, then that removes the option of not doing it in the future.
Sure.
If that makes sense. So I think that's
a definite finality too. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it makes me feel like I'd have to be much more sure about one than the other to.
Sure.
Yeah. But I mean, the idea of sort of you describe it as like palliative care. I think that would be the sort of I feel like that would be the best way to do it, is to, people worry about if we have population decline, then like who's going to look after the old people and all that? Like,
Yeah.
there are technology solutions for those kind of things, but that's sort of like, something we'd have to think about on the way.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for your thoughts on that. Well, I know we don't have much time left, but I wanted to say how much I have been enjoying the Morality is Hard podcast. Can you tell me a little something about how that project began?
Sure. Well, thank you. That's nice to hear.
Absolutely.
It's another project which I unfortunately haven't had as much time to work on as I'd like to in the recent past. It really just started because I wanted to. There were people I wanted to talk to about particular issues, and that was just a convenient outlet for asking people to have a chat with me, and then to just record it and share it a little bit. So, I think casting my mind, but I think the first episode was just with a friend of mine who was a PhD candidate at the University of Adelaide doing philosophy, Robert Farquharson. And then it just started from there, and I kept thinking about who do I want to interview next, and I'd just reach out to them, and usually people would. I've never done podcast. I'd never done podcasting or anything like that. But I was pleasantly surprised to realize that pretty much everyone I reached out to was willing to have a chat and be recorded for the podcast. So it's something I will definitely want to pick up again, hopefully next year.
Good.
I have ideas for who I want to interview next. I want to I guess diversify a little bit, because I think mostly so far it's been about animal rights, and I want to guess spread into some other ideas to challenge myself just as much as to challenge any listeners. I mean, it'd be cool if like I changed my mind about some topic over the course of a podcast episode. I think that'd be like that's kind of the goal, I guess. So stay tuned. Hopefully that'll be coming back in next year, and hopefully the YouTube channel as well.
Excellent.
How'd you come up with the name?
I kind of the main point I was very interested in getting across with the podcast is the idea that people tend to assume that ethical issues have very simple answers. People think of some scenario and they're like, oh, that's, it's easy. The right thing to do in that case is this. And for two sort of different categories of reasons, I was trying to, the goal of the podcast is to show people why it's not quite so easy. It's actually very hard. So one is that people have like the normative ethics, and it's to challenge people to think, well, a lot of people disagree with you and your normative ethics. So it's you'd have to be, just to make people think, well, you actually, you might not be right about your normative ethics. Like you might be misguided or something. But then also that, then more about like, more like a scientific uncertainty in that just the kind of, every action has a lot of different possible outcomes, and especially when you consider the far future or even the near future, just not the immediate term. And so that makes, that things can have like negative unintended impacts, and that makes the question of what is right even harder. So the name morality is hard is just to convey that, like, I'm trying to get people to think that actually even really simple questions of like, what would you do in this scenario actually can have very complicated answers. It's not necessarily easy even for simple things.
Well, I want to particularly recommend the episode with Oscar Horta to our audience. I think it's an excellent conversation that you guys had. The thing I respect most about the podcast is that you really do seem to be like intentionally trying to throw yourself off kilter, to some extent, really challenging yourself what have been the ideas that you've faced that have been like the most brutal to you, like the most devastating to kind of face? Like, what are the ethical or moral issues that are the most hard?
Well, not so much from my podcast. This was a little bit before, but because you mentioned Oscar Horta, wild animal suffering. When I first heard about that, it was just a complete kind of game changer for me. That probably like in recent years, that's probably one of the biggest like ethical kind of shifts I'd had, is from not really thinking about the life of a wild animal too much to realizing, oh my goodness, like it sounds horrifying, and that sounds like such a bad experience. The first thing I read about wild animal suffering was by Brian Tomasic, one of his papers on it, and I just remember reading that. I stumbled upon it, and I read it out of interest, and just being more and more horrified the more I read, and then finished reading the paper and then thought about it and thought, wow, this has really changed my perspective on such a big thing. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest ethical shift I've had, like very quick ethical shift I've had in my life. But then another one, and again, it's not so much from the podcast. I'm trying to think of specific things from the podcast that I've changed my mind on in a conversation. Nothing's coming to mind right now, but just in general, another big one is going from thinking that existential risk reduction is one of the most important things and that the future is positive in expectation, to thinking maybe and probably not. So yeah, I mean, I meant to say this earlier, but I started my PhD, and I picked this topic because I was concerned about existential risk reduction, and I wanted to work on, I just thought about how can I use my geoscience background, like what kind of existential risk problems can I use that skill set to address, and asteroid impacts, comet impacts came to mind. And then to realize over the course of my PhD that it's really not so easy, I think, not so simple an answer. So that was another big ethical change I've had.
All right. Well, Mark, is there anything that you wanted to add or that I've missed?
I want to ask if there's actually anything that Michael wanted to add, or if there's any comments before we wrap up.
Nothing,
do you think we missed anything?
Yeah. Not that I can really think of. It's so just, I mean, to come back to the like hard versus soft antinatalism, it's something that I feel like I should try and actively challenge myself on from time to time, to really see if my views on that change. And because I think it's, I mean, for a lot of practical purposes, I see the difference as being not that important. I'd probably act in roughly the same way, but it's still fairly important to think, am I wrong about something like that big? So yeah, I appreciate you kind of challenging me to try and explain it, because I've realized it's very hard for me to even explain why I think the way I think. So yeah, thank you for that. And I need to think about all that some more. No, I don't think there's anything. I don't think we've missed anything. Nothing I can think of, at least.
Cool.
Where can people find you, Michael? Where can people continue to support your work?
So normally I'd say my main way is michaeldello.com, which is my website, but unfortunately that's been down for a little while and I'm trying to fix it, but hopefully that'll be fixed soon, and I've got to fix the domain name. But in general, that's the kind of main place I'd recommend people to go to. Or there's my YouTube channel, Vegan Space Scientist, which you mentioned, and the podcast Morality is Hard, which is on SoundCloud and iTunes. And I think that's it.
Okay, excellent. Well, Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much for being our guest on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. I think you're doing a lot of really fascinating work, and just really excited to see what you do in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I just want to say, Amanda, I discovered you, I think maybe 1 or 2 years ago. I think it was around the time that I decided to make my video. I discovered your YouTube channel.
Yeah.
I think it was one of my first sort of pieces of content of antinatalism that I'd seen, probably except for the David Benatar's work. But other than that, I think yours is one of the first. And
thank you, Michael.
Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
that means a lot.
That's probably how this came about. I think I probably left a YouTube comment somewhere, or I entered the competition last year, the Anti-natalist competition.
You did, yes. You were
Yeah.
you were one of the entrants. I think it was 2 years ago now. My sense of time is so screwed up because of the coronavirus and everything. It's like, how much time has gone by? But thank you. That makes me happy to hear. Please subscribe to Vegan Space Scientist on YouTube. Follow him on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and listen to the Morality is Hard podcast. Links below. Thank you for listening to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast. This has been Amanda Oldphan, Sukenick, and Mark J. Maharaj. You can find Mark on the YouTube channel !, and you can now find me on the YouTube channel Anti-Natal Wolf. Links below. Keep up with my daily anti-natalist news updates at Antinatal News on Twitter. Please follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Buzzsprout, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Amazon.com, RSS feed, and so many other platforms. You can email us at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com. Our website, www.exploringantinatalism.com, was designed by the incredible Visions Noirs. Please follow him at www.bionoir.com as well as Instagram. Logo art by the amazing Life Sucks. Please subscribe to him on YouTube, and if you would perhaps like to purchase one of the new Exploring Antinatalism t-shirts by Life Sucks, then please go check out his Etsy at www.etsy.com/shop/LifeSucksPublishing. Our incredible theme music was donated by the wonderful I Doubt It. Please subscribe to him on YouTube, and please check out our collaborative project together with our friend Eiffel WV, The Right to No Longer Exist, which includes the new podcast, The Right to No Longer Exist, A Right to Die podcast. All the best, and bye for now.